you know, I can't be inclusive. There are a lot of other publications that I respect. Those are the ones I rely on most. And I think, as I say, that the printed word is a good way to hold the spoken word to the test. Because if you read it, you live with it, and they don't. Yes, ma'am.
I had someone tell me recently that she thought listening to the British news was the best way of getting a good.
We listen to the BBC sometimes. It's on public radio.
Do you think that's accurate, though? I mean,
I think they do a good job. I generally go as far as when they get into the soccer scores and then I lose interest. You know, they do some good coverage. They don't cover much of what we're talking about right now because they're an international, you know, they're a British broadcaster, and they're more interested in Britain and Europe and so forth than they are in what goes on here. But they do some presidential campaign coverage, the highlights, and I think it's pretty good stuff. Yes, sir.
Would you add The Economist to your list of readings?
Yeah, I think that's, but that's more a periodical and not a daily
Right.
news
That-
source.
Yeah.
But they do some thoughtful stuff, as do some other magazines. Yes, ma'am.
With all your past experience, what do you think the voter turnout is going to be this year? Do you think, you know, just like what you were talking about, people are so torn between?
I think it's likely to be low, which I think is risky. I mean, we ought to be ashamed of our voter turnout patterns in this country anyhow. If we get to 60% in the presidential year, we think we're really doing great, but that's silly. I mean, but I think when the choice is between two candidates that nobody wants, I shouldn't say nobody, that's in the basket of the poor, two candidates that most people say they don't want, that is not likely to inspire people to turn out and vote. So my suspicion is that it will not be a high turnout election. Yes?
To what degree are we reflecting what Congress is doing? They're not completing any projects or, you know, any significant legislation.
It all feeds on itself.
They'll come back and say, well, we're reflecting our voters. I think the voters would like them to compromise.
I think the voter, but if you look at any survey done on the question of what's wrong with Congress, you will see that wide majority say they have to get along, compromise, interact. You know, when I covered Congress, the goal was to get things done. The goal now, particularly of the so-called Freedom Caucus, which is the most misnamed outfit I can imagine, is to prevent things from being done. There was anyway, there are pieces where most everybody agrees it ought to be done. Criminal justice reform is one. It was a bill that was up last week. The Republican leadership said, no, we're not going to take it up. It's too divisive. Even though it had support from Democrats and Republicans, and the Republican Senate Judiciary Committee had approved it by a wide margin, there were people who didn't like it, and my feeling is that the Senate leader particularly plays to the lowest common denominator and says, that we just won't touch that. Look at the Supreme Court nomination. Yes, ma'am.
Of all the people that you've covered in the past, who do you think would be a good leader for today's America? Who do you, if you could bring somebody forward to lead our country today, who would that be?
Oh gosh, it would have to be a hybrid. You know, I would say somebody with the intelligence and talents of Nixon, with the morals of Carter, with the political ability of Clinton. Unfortunately, we don't get to patch together our leadership, take out the bad stuff and leave the good. And I'm not sure who, I know of nobody on the current scene that I would say, met that test. I know of a lot of people who would meet it better than the two people who are leading the tickets now.
Rock has a question.
Oh,
He keeps raising his hand.
no, the first thing I was gonna ask you, is the system served well by the length of the campaigns? And is there anything we can do realistically to shorten that time?
Well, the answer to the second half is no. The answer to the first half is probably yes, but, we take on a contract for 4 years. If we spend a year worrying about who's gonna get it, I don't think that's out of line.
Yeah, but it does seem like January 21st, that's when the next presidential election starts. That's when-
Well, I don't know, January 21st, but give it a year or so and it will.
It's 3 years.
Well, it certainly was true when Barack Obama was elected president and the leader of the Senate, the Republican leader of the Senate, said his first job was to make sure everyone reelected. No, that's not your first job. That's the mindset. Yeah, it'd be nice to have short, sweet presidential campaigns and auditions that didn't go on forever and so forth, but I don't know how you get around it with our system. And there's no way to make them shorter because you can't pass a law making them shorter. And you can't get a candidate with a real chance to say, well, I won't start until, the 4th of July, because by then everybody will say they're so far behind they can't catch up. So I think we're stuck with the system. I just wish we weren't stuck with the candidates. The dynastic system, I don't think is supposed to be the system here. And Clinton's part of it, for sure. She wouldn't be a candidate for president if she hadn't been married to a president. Jeb Bush wouldn't have been running for president if he wasn't from the Bush family and the son of the president, brother of the president.
I think I read something where there was a 50-year stretch in the Republican Party, with the exception of Goldberg, that there was one of 3 names on the national ticket: Dole, Bush, or Nixon. That's dynastic, don't you think?
Well, at least it's not family. I think that, the reason that when I talk about dynastic, I think it simply is triggered by the fact that the name Bush, for example, is one that everybody knows. Everybody knew the name Bush when George W. ran in the first place, even though his father had been denied a second term. But name recognition has become, the test and the way in. And I don't think that's a great idea.
Do you think Bush was a good president?
Bush the first, Bush the second.
You
The
think-
second, no.
Yeah.
I thought his father was a good but very flawed president, but an honest one. I thought George W. was driven, I knew him quite well when he was governor of Texas and when his father was president. And I thought he had ideas that were his own. When he became president, he didn't seem to follow them. He was driven, to the right to get us into a war which Cheney and Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz had written a piece for a defense periodical 3 years before Bush became president, postulating a war against Saddam Hussein. It was their project. He signed on. And, a whole bunch of young men paid the dues, and the country is still paying them. And the Middle East is a disaster, I think, in large measure because of that war. I think the war in Afghanistan, obviously that's a disaster too. I never could figure out why nobody ever remembered that punitive strikes. You know, after 9/11, if they just bombed out the headquarters of the president we so hated, but not sent troops. I mean, people since Rudyard Kipling have been writing about getting into Afghanistan being a disaster. We got too many people that bother to read, I guess.
How about Johnson in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution?
Well, the Gulf of Tonkin turns out, with long analysis, to have been based on a fabrication. But, at the time, the story was we had been attacked, and that's far less provable than it was said to be at the time. But that's what motivated this rush to give the president the authority to do whatever he wanted in Vietnam. Obviously, a very bad move. But the bad move had already begun. I mean, bad moves began under Kennedy. He was the first one to send advisors, military advisor units into Vietnam. You can trace it all the way back to Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, who sabotaged the Southeast Asian Peace Conference in 1956, which would have settled the whole thing but allowed free elections in all of Vietnam. Except that the administration wouldn't stand for that because Ho Chi Minh would have easily won any election in all of Vietnam. Yes, sir.
How do you think a Kennedy Goldwater election campaign would have differed from the one in '64, and then what effect would that have had on the events of the '60s, both here and Southeast Asia?
Well, you know, you get people now, hindsight apologists for Kennedy who say he was going to pull out in his second term of Vietnam. Goldwater claimed, although nobody ever confirmed it, and I never really believed it, that he and Kennedy had agreed that their campaign would be conducted by having both of them travel together and appear on the same stage at every stop. I mean, I think that was fiction, but Barry kind of winged it every now and then. I don't know that the election would come out any differently. Goldwater was not going to be elected president of the United States. His ideas were not acceptable to too big a majority of the population. But then you come down to the unknowable, which was, you know, pass the election and no longer worried about the impact. Where Kennedy has said, okay, Vietnam is not where we should be. And you can find people who argue that he would have, but who knows?
Mr. Mears, I have two questions here on the cards that are related to the Goldwater campaign, and everybody can still ask their questions, trying to keep on the subject. This may be something that Carl read. It says, isn't it true that Goldwater was handpicked to go against Kennedy? How would a Kennedy-Goldwater campaign have differed from the Johnson-Goldwater campaign?
Well, I think
That's what I just.
There's a little bit, it might be a little bit redundant.
I don't know who handpicked Goldwater. He ran against Nelson Rockefeller, and you know, his campaign team did a very good job of lining up delegates in those pre-primary days. There were only a handful of presidential primaries. Goldwater, I think, ran in 4 and won 1. But they won their delegates in caucuses all over the place, below the radar. So that by the time they got to the California primary, which Perry did win narrowly, Cliff White, his campaign strategist, said we had the delegates to win even without California, because they'd gone around the country very quietly, lining up delegates. And you know, the party was split, Goldwater and Rockefeller, but I wouldn't say Goldwater was handpicked.
I think Mark may have written this one. Did the two losing campaigns, Goldwater in 1964 and McGovern in 1972, shape the current two parties, i.e. ideology? Is the question.
I don't think so. As I say, all these people, all the Republicans now run around saying I'm a Reagan Republican, but Reagan would be drummed out of today's Republican Party. And McGovern was more in the Bernie Sanders side of the Democratic Party, and that's not controlling either. So I don't think that they set the stage for much of anything. They just got clobbered.
Yeah, I have a question. At the end of your talk, you brought up the whole Trump birther thing. On Friday, he had his press conference where you know, he basically said Obama was born in the United States, period, but that was only, you know, his actual comments were only a few seconds, and they were out, you know, they were preceded by you know, a whole bunch of, you know, veterans and the veterans making a speech, you know, even longer than Trump's remarks, and you know, CNN in particular, John King said, "We've been played again. We've been played again." Is there any campaigns you covered? Were there any campaigns that you were sort of frustrated or angered by, you know, kind of them toying with the press? You know, can you think of any that you know, that you covered that just, you know, you felt frustrated by?
No more one than another. I mean, candidates forever. The missions of the political reporters covering campaigns and of the candidates trying to win are not complimentary. The reporters are trying to find out things that campaigns don't want to know. And presidents and presidential candidates are always complaining about the press. I think John's complaint, which I didn't see but read about, was basically that they were told Trump said, "I'm going to have a major announcement." So they brought the cameras, set him up. He promoted his hotel for a long time. And he had these generals that nobody ever heard of talk for a long time. And then for 70 seconds, he tried to rescind and wipe away what he built his whole political base on in the beginning. So yeah, they did get played, and I think you know, putting the cameras on going in, so you couldn't get played like that if you were a print reporter. You couldn't bother to write it down. You take the news and, you know, throw away the rest. But with the technology that exists now, everything is news, supposedly, and it isn't.
Do you think Lyndon Johnson's decision to let the churches not preach from the pulpit have softened America's characters and values?
Johnson's
His decision to not let people preach political news from the pulpit.
I'm not familiar with Johnson's decision on.
Yeah, it was early days.
I'm not sure how any president could make that decision. He could say, "I don't think you ought to be talking
Well,
about
right now, it's still, the IRS says you can't preach from can't preach political.
Well, the IRS
Actually,
says you can't
that's based on Johnson's decision to not, congressional decision to not let political
That has to do with
preach
tax
from the pulpit.
exemptions. That has to do with tax exempt organizations.
Yeah, I knew that.
I think that whole thing
It's
is
from Johnson originally.
I think that whole area of tax exempt organizations, see, you've got all these Republicans now wanting to go after the IRS commission who weren't even there.
Yeah, but why would he want to silence the political effects in the church?
As I said, I'm not familiar with Johnson causing that to happen,
Yeah.
but I do know that you can't have a tax exempt organization that's overtly political. Unfortunately, there's now a law that says that a percentage, and I guess it's half, of what you do can be politically, and you can still have your tax exemption. So if half your sermon is politics, I guess you can get by with it if you want to argue the case. I think that asking the IRS to decide what is politically acceptable and what is not,
Bad decision.
is on the face of it a disastrous idea. You don't want the tax man making decisions like that.
Right.
I also think that the Republican outrage over the IRS heading the Tea Parties, they were under mandate from Congress to deal with political organizations claiming tax exemptions. And so you put the word Tea Party in, obviously. I mean, that's where the action was at the time. I don't think that was the wrong thing to do. But I think for Congress to set it up that way was a disastrously wrong thing to do, I think. If you want to be tax exempt, fine, be a charitable organization. But don't be a charitable quasi-political organization and claim that your percentage is low enough that you can still take your tax exemptions.
Yeah, of all the presidents we've had, who do you think, your opinion, was the best president of all time? I mean, tell us who you think is the best president.
Of all 44,
All of them, I don't care who. Now, really, tell me, who do you think, if you know the ins and outs, who do you think was the best?
I don't know, I know the ins and outs, so obviously Lincoln was one of our greatest, if not the greatest president, because he saved the country. If you come to modern times, FDR was a great president, he stayed too long. But it's, that's more history than I feel expert on, because again, in most of these things, a combination of talents among a group of people is the best way to describe the best leader that you could have.